Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for sticking out to the last session of the conference. I really appreciate it. So before I start, a couple of things. Going to be talking about continuous learning for developers. Going to be discussing things that you can do to improve your learning experience, improve your skills. But I'm not going to be talking a lot about educational theory or learning philosophy. I'm trying to stick strictly to the practical things that you can do, things that you can apply in your everyday. Having said that, if anything I just said or anything I say during this talk isn't what you expected or isn't really working out for you, I encourage you to take advantage of what's called the law of mobility. There are a lot of other sessions going on at this time. Feel free to, go look for something that works better for you. I won't mind. Although, foreshadowing, I'm going to come back to this concept at the end of the talk if you do stick it out. So, here we go. Has anybody seen this quote before? Learn at least one new language every year. Yeah, it's from The Pragmatic Programmer, an excellent book, and full disclosure, I used to work for this publisher. So when Andy and Dave wrote that, they meant it to be a goal. If you look in the book for where this quote appears, you'll find the heading says goals. But folks took it as engineers are wont to do and took it literally and decided, oh, I have to learn a new language every 365 days or I lose my developer card. But really, it's just meant to emphasize the fact that our industry is continually changing. There are continually new things we have to learn, new languages, new frameworks, new tools, new distribution methods. If I'd been giving this talk, a couple of years ago, we wouldn't be talking about Kubernetes. Who'd heard of Kubernetes 2 years ago? And now that's what half a dozen talks at this conference were about. So what I encourage you to do, and what this talk is about, is how you can maximize your potential for learning. We understand that we have to do this, that we have to continually do this, but people don't have a plan. They think, okay, I'll get a book, I'll leave it in my office, maybe I'll read it every now and again. Well, if I were engaging in a fitness program and I said, I'm going to buy some weights and I'll leave them in my office and every once in a while I'll pick them up, I probably wouldn't get the results I'm looking for. And if you do that with a technical book, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. What I encourage you to do is think of this as an investment. It's an investment in yourself. If you have a good learning program, you'll be more effective at work, you'll help your team, and let's be blunt about it, you'll increase your earning potential. So, how is it that we can make this the most effective? It would be great if our employers gave us time and resources with which to continue our learning. My employer, DigitalOcean, does. And if yours does, that's fantastic, but a lot don't. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. Ways to maximize that time that you're having to take on your own with your own resources to invest in yourself. So I'm giving away the big secret at the top of the talk. The key is engagement. I don't mean engagement like that. I just couldn't resist the joke. I mean engagement like this. So what's engagement? Engagement is what happens when your motivation to learn meshes with the content that you're trying to learn from, combined with the environment that you're learning in, to maximize your learning opportunity. Now, all of that sounds a little bit fancy, so let me put it another way. Who's ever been in the zone while doing sports or something? Yeah, okay. Has anybody been in the zone while coding? Okay, a little more, that's good. You can be in the zone while learning. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, when you're in the zone, you're in a heightened state where things that would normally seem hard are easier, things that would seem easy are automatic, and things that would get in your way don't seem to be as much of a problem. You can do that while learning, and that's the goal. You want to have a learning experience where things come more easily to you. But the reason most of us aren't familiar with being in the zone while we're learning is because we allow blockers to get in the way. Things that we don't even think about that prevent us from having the optimal experience. So I'm going to be talking about that and how to get rid of them. Let's start with the easy stuff, the stuff that's more under your control. the blockers that we can get out of the way easily. Start with your own physical form. When you're learning, try not to be too hungry. Try not to be too full. Try not to be too tired. Try not to be in physical pain. I know I'm saying pretty obvious things, right? If I just broke my arm, I'm not going to sit down with a Python book. But think about this. How many times when you were in school, high school or college, did you sit down to do some homework with a splitting headache? And you powered right through it because, that's what I ought to do. What if instead you'd taken a couple of aspirin, laid down for an hour, then come back to it? That's what I'm talking about with these blockers. People think that the blockers aren't under their control, but they might be more than you think. So moving on from the internal stuff, external things to consider. How much sound is around you? Now, speaking for myself, I like to study in perfect silence. I blame my parents and their homework rules. Our developer here looks like she prefers some ambient noise of humans around. Maybe white noise, maybe music. These could be things that work for you. Think about the light level. How often do you think about, how much light do I get? I like natural light for learning, but you can do fluorescence or LEDs depending on what you prefer. Think about your location. And by that I mean, where am I doing it, but also what physically am I doing? In other words, if I'm reading a book, I'm probably going to be sitting in a different chair than if I'm watching a video. Also think about having everything you need ready before you sit down to learn. If you've got that great chair that you want to read a book in, and you come across some practice exercises and you want to do them, you have to get up, go in the next room, boot your machine, then it needs a system update, and the next thing you know, you're out of the zone. So get that stuff ready beforehand. Put yourself in an optimal location to learn. And then the most important of the externals is time. I don't know about you all, but I used to have a train commute years ago, and I would see people trying to read textbooks while on the train between stations. And not only is that, a problem in terms of the various other externals, but it's not enough time. Maybe commutes out here are better, or the trains are nicer, I don't know. So allow yourself enough time to get into the zone, because any athlete will tell you it's not instantaneous. And then allow yourself to have some time at that optimal level in order to do the learning. So that means you're going to have to carve out this time for yourself. Find the best time of day to do it. Do you work best in the morning? Do you work best in the evening? Lunch hour? But give yourself time to do the work. Now, I suspect a lot of you are thinking, okay, that's a really nice list of things that he just said we could control, but I don't live in an ideal world. Maybe you've got kids, maybe you've elderly parent, maybe there's a lot of people who live in your house, and you've just got some things that aren't in your control. And that's fine. I understand we're all human and we have things that we need to do. But consider that each one of these little blockers is a trade-off. Each time you accept a blocker as something that's outside of your control, you're sacrificing a little bit of learning efficiency, and that's going to affect that investment that you're making in yourself. So maybe you can't control all of them, but maybe you can control some. Maybe you can control the noise level in the house, or maybe early in the morning isn't exactly when you want to be, but it's the time that you'll be undisturbed. So keep that in mind. All right, talked about physical stuff. The most important thing outside of that is your mental attitude towards what you're learning. If you're curious about what you want to learn, if you're interested in what you want to learn, you're halfway to engaged already. But what happens if it's not? What if it's, I've heard about Python, I'm not really sure if I'd like it or not, I think I'd like to give it a try. How do you motivate yourself towards learning that? Well, have a goal. Not necessarily that kind of goal. But thinking in management terms here, the terms that you've probably used to define a goal is discrete and a goal is measurable. And by that, I don't mean that you have to give yourself a grade, but let me give you an example. If I say, I want to learn Python, well, that's kind of a goal, but it's not measurable. How do I know when I've learned enough Python? How much is enough? I don't know if you've looked at Python books lately, but there's an awful lot of them, and some of them are gigantic. Do I need to get through that entire book? Does that mean I've learned Python? What if instead I had a goal like, for example, I want to build myself an app that uses a machine learning algorithm written in Python to take as input my music collection and output the names of other artists I might enjoy. This is a measurable goal. I'd know when I've done it or not. I can break this down into smaller steps. So I'm going to need to learn some about machine learning algorithms. I'm probably going to need to learn about the statistics packages that go with Python. I'll need to learn about NumPy. I'll need to know about scikit-learn. Following it further back, then I'll need to know about control flow, and I'll need to know about the basics of Python. It'll depend on where I'm starting. So you break that down, and with each little step you take forward, you get a little hit of dopamine, and that helps you move towards your goal and keep you motivated. Important point here. Reaching the goal is not the most important thing. I'm kind of a board game fan. There's a famous board game designer called Rainier Knizia. He has a quote: "When playing a game, the goal is to win, but it's the goal that's important, not the winning." So if I'm working with my machine learning algorithm and I get 80, 90% of the way there and I get stuck and I realize, you know what, this goal was a little bit too ambitious. I didn't know that when I started out. I was starting from ignorance. If you get 90% of the way there, that looks pretty good to me. You've learned some Python. That was what you wanted to do. If you even get 10% of the way there, that's more than where you started from. So that's progress. Having the goal, having something to move towards, is what's going to help you with that motivation. Now, sidebar, what happens when the goal isn't your decision? In other words, when somebody above you in the chain says, this is what you're going to do. So example here, management shows up and says, hey, we're going to be converting the website from JavaScript to TypeScript. You all need to learn TypeScript. You have 3 months. Maybe you've never heard of TypeScript. Maybe you're not particularly interested in TypeScript. How can you create that curiosity, that motivation in that sort of a situation? Well, odds are, hopefully, the decision from management was not made arbitrarily. So you can go ask, what's the reason here? All right, the reason is, the site's getting bigger, we're being more successful, and we've heard that TypeScript is more maintainable than JavaScript, so that's what we want to do. Okay. Maybe you don't agree with that, but that's still a motivation. Now you've got something to work from. If you go to management at that point and go, no, TypeScript, no. Well, that's not a very convincing argument to management. But if you go through the learning process, get some knowledge under your belt, and then you can go to management and say, hey, I've learned this, I have a certificate, I've done these courses, and I think that TypeScript is really not going to work for this situation because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, that's a more convincing argument. So you've motivated yourself with the desire to make that argument. And if all else fails, try and keep an open mind. Somebody somewhere had a reason for requesting that you learn this. All right. I'm going to take a sip and we'll move on. I want to talk a bit about learning styles. Has anybody heard of learning styles before? Not many. All right, that's fine. Quick crash course here. This is as much into educational theory as I'm ever going to get. The idea behind learning styles is, you've probably heard somebody say, I'm a visual learner. And the idea was that each person, each student, has a particular style that works for them. And if you, the instructor, could provide that information in that manner, then all of the barriers fall away and they'll just get it immediately. Well, spoiler alert, there's not a lot of empirical evidence that this works, but there's still reason to learn about them, and I'll come to that in a second. Now, how many learning styles are there and what are there? Of course, there's as many as there were academics who wrote papers. Some people said there were as many as 70. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick to 4, abbreviated VARK, which I will go through and explain to you how they apply to tech, because it's not always obvious. The first style is the visual. Visual style refers to the information and its relation to other data in space, relative size, relative location, connection between them. It's actually fairly easy to see how this applies to tech because, I put a flow chart here, if anyone's old enough to remember that. Or if anybody's old enough to remember UML, that was an attempt to, thank you, that was an attempt to model-oriented programming in a visual manner. You also find it on the systems side, right? Network diagrams, architectural diagrams. If you're laying out where are my microservices, where do they relate to each other, what APIs do they sit behind, that's all visual data. Charts, graphs, diagrams, this is all the visual style of learning. The next style is the auditory style, which is what you're all doing right now. You're listening to me, hopefully. But the part of the auditory style that I want you to consider is the speaking style. Has anybody heard of rubber duck debugging? Yeah, more than I usually get. Okay. The idea behind rubber duck debugging is if you're having a problem, a coding problem or a networking problem, you go grab a coworker and you say, look, just listen to me think out loud so I can think through this. When you do that act of thinking out loud, you're engaging a different part of your brain, and two things happen. One, you have to slow down in order to explain it. And two, you have to synthesize the problem. Instead of being a big blob of information labeled problem, you've got a specific set of points that you're having a problem with, and you discover that when you explain it to somebody else. This is where the rubber duck comes in. You don't actually need your coworker to be doing anything. He could be a rubber duck instead. And if you replace him with one, then your coworker can go back to doing some actual work. But it's that action of thinking out loud, of synthesizing the problem that's important in the auditory style. So the next one up is reading, writing style. This seems pretty obvious. Textbooks, you read them. But I would also encourage you to think about the writing part of this style. I see some folks taking notes here, which is fantastic. Thank you for the demo. When you're writing something down and taking notes, you're doing the same thing that you are when you're speaking out loud. You're engaging yet another part of your brain. You're synthesizing the information. You're writing down what's important to you. You're putting it in your own words. I assume that the folks taking notes here are not writing down every word I say verbatim. If you are, I apologize for the jokes. But what that does is it helps you pull out the critical information so that you can retain it. It doesn't even matter if you never read the notes again. The act of adding something physical to the information, the act of writing, plus that synthesis helps you retain better. I take notes a lot. I take notes furiously, actually. I don't always go back and read them because the act of taking the notes aids in my recall. The last style is what they call the kinesthetic style, and it's most often expressed as muscle memory. How does this apply to tech? Folks are probably familiar with the kinesthetic style, sports, dance, the martial arts here. When I learned martial arts several years ago, if I wanted to learn a new kick, I couldn't just watch somebody do it and then do it myself. My wife could. She had that gift. I didn't. I would have to watch somebody do it, try it out, get it wrong, get corrected, get it wrong a little more, get corrected again. Trial and error. And that trial and error, followed by lots and lots of practice, is how I would learn these physical movements. What you want is to reach a point where, if you're in a sparring situation, and you think, I want to throw a kick, you don't think, okay, now which kick, and how do I do that, and what exactly do I... You can't do that in a sparring situation. You have to think, kick, and throw one. If it's cemented, if it's part of your muscle memory, then it's going to be automatic. Do I want you to be able to do that with code or with networking? Yeah, I do, but not in the way that you might think. It doesn't mean you have to memorize every little bit of syntax or every little command, because that's what references are for. But I want you to be able to see the patterns so that when you come across a coding pattern, you can go, oh, I've seen this, I know what to do, because I've practiced. It comes automatically. You run into a networking situation, you can go, I've seen this, I know what to do. Or, more likely, I've seen something like this. Let me try the solution to that and see if it works. So a couple of minutes ago, I said that the learning styles didn't really have a whole lot of empirical background behind them. In other words, if you take somebody who says they're a visual learner and you give them visual material, they don't do any better on a test than a visual learner who was forced to learn from a textbook. It's about the same. So why am I even talking about it? Because it's a preference. You don't necessarily have a learning style, you have a learning preference. And if that's the case, why would you learn from something that's against your preference? That's putting a blocker in place. If you know you don't learn well from textbooks, don't use a textbook. Seems obvious, but the societal pressure on us that there's one way to learn and this is the way it's done prevents people from seeing this blocker, or prevents people from seeing a style as a blocker. Now, with that said, and I've just given you the freedom to make whatever choice you like, I'm going to get didactic about one thing. Old joke, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Practice, repeated practice, good practice is where the learning happens. It's what reinforces it. So in other words, I'm saying use whatever style appeals to you, but you can't skip the kinesthetic style. You can't lose the practice. All right. So that was as close to theory as I'm going to get. Let's talk about the actual tools that you would use to do this learning. If I were giving this talk 20 years ago, I'd be saying, okay, go get yourself a good textbook and have fun with that. But fortunately, we live in the 21st century. There are new delivery methods for instructional materials, and they map pretty nicely to the various styles, which is why I'm going to talk about them and see how they work for you. I spent about 25 years in book publishing before I joined DigitalOcean, so we're starting with books because I'm a book guy. Books are pretty obvious how you use them. They engage the reading-writing style. They're probably going to engage with the visual style as well. I just finished editing a book on data structures and algorithms, and I can assure you that if you're trying to explain how to do a depth-first search on a binary tree, you're going to want to draw a picture of that. That one's tricky to explain in words. And the kinesthetic, the practice, that can be in there too. The most obvious is when you've got a textbook with practice questions at the end of every chapter and answers in the back. Not all books have those, but they do have some kinesthetic value. Oftentimes, if the book is written well, there'll be an example in the chapter that you can follow through. And I would encourage you to do that. Just because it doesn't say stop and practice doesn't mean you shouldn't. Follow through with that example. Do it once to see if you can get the exact same results the author did. Do it again and make some modifications. See how it fits into your particular problem or whatever you're trying to solve. So kinesthetic ought to be there, and you can usually find it if you look. So there's a handful of slides in here that people tend to like to take pictures of. This is one of them. So this is a list of where can I get these. In other words, it's a list of publishers. The folks at the top, your Pragmatic, O'Reilly, No Starch, they tend to be by developers for developers type of publisher. They focus on the practical, they focus on solving problems, getting things done, less on the theory. The folks towards the bottom of the list, Addison, Wesley, and Prentice Hall, they're textbook publishers. So the content tends to be a little bit more theoretical, a little bit more abstract. And conversely, though, they're the ones that are more likely to have the practice exercises in each chapter, because it's part of our traditional learning methodology. I want to take a little bit of a sidebar here and mention online tutorials, like the ones produced by my employer. They're text, generally, found online, usually free, so you engage with them in the same way that you would engage with a book. They tend to be shorter. They tend to have nice walkthroughs that you can follow through, so the kinesthetic is engaged. However, there's a big buyer beware when it comes to online tutorials. They're free, and you don't necessarily know where they came from. The ones from DigitalOcean, bragging on my employer for a second, have all been vetted and tested before we published them. So we know that they worked at least on the day we published them. Some other sources that you get, you don't know where they came from. They might have been posted online without a whole lot of testing. So I encourage you to read the comments. believe it or not. If there's comments at the bottom of a tutorial that say, this didn't work for me, I kept getting these errors, then maybe a little buyer beware. If there are comments that say, yeah, fantastic, this is great, then good. The comments can also tell you when tutorials go out of date, because they tend to. So, end of sidebar. So talking about video. Video is something that has been improving within the last 10 or 15 years. We were all of us in the industry of education were told the older generations, they like books, but millennials and under, they like video. They're not going to read your book. And it turns out that was a bit of a lie, because it was told to us by folks who produce video. Go figure. Two types of video that you're going to commonly see. The first one is called studio video. It's an instructor in a studio talking to a camera. They'll probably have a whiteboard. They might have props. They may even have some students to simulate the learning experience, and they'll occasionally cut away to their terminal or their IDE so you can see what they're doing. That type is a little bit more expensive to produce, and so it costs you a little more as a consumer. The type that is becoming much more common these days is called a screencast. You don't see the instructor. You'll primarily just see their IDE or their terminal window. They're recording what's on their screen with a voiceover. Maybe they'll do a little talking head down in the corner if they're being fancy. These are much easier to create because the instructor can just create them at home, recording them on their own machine. Now, either of these two is going to engage the audio style because you're listening to the instructor talking. Visual style, yes, on the studio videos, a little bit less on the screencasts, because you're essentially just watching what's on somebody's screen, like you were watching over their shoulder. Kinesthetic, much the same as books. You'll have that practice opportunity. Some of the videos will stop after each learning unit and give you some practice problems. Other ones will allow you to follow along with an example that the instructor is giving. The screencasts are especially good with this. If you're choosing to follow along, because you're probably watching it on your monitor, you can have the video up in one window and your own terminal window up next to it and just follow along with. So the opportunity is there again, but you have to still go out and get it. Here's a list of some video producers. These folks at the top tend to have a lot more content in a broader range of topics. Folks down at the bottom tend to be a little bit more specialized, as you might guess. Front-end Masters specializes in front-end development topics. Also, a lot of the folks from the last list slide are also making videos now, because the book publishers all woke up one morning and found out that these guys were eating their lunch, so they decided to make some videos. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily good or bad. These folks focus on video, so they're pretty good at it. But the book publishers, they're also pretty good at conveying information. So don't discount their videos just because they're primarily a book publisher. Yes. Code Academy, right. Oh, did I spell it wrong? I'll check that. I'd be willing to bet that they both work. So. Okay, thank you. Good. That's why I asked, but I didn't know. Yes. So the next format I want to talk about is so new it doesn't really have a given name. I call it interactives. The key thing about the interactive is that it front loads the practice process. It makes it central to the learning experience. Let me show you what this looks like. I'm not going to do a live demo. This is just a screenshot. This is a screenshot of an interactive module from a company called Kata Coda. They were recently acquired by O'Reilly, so they're part of the O'Reilly Learning Network now. And the way this works is the content here on the left will be some text or some video, and it's the type of content that you would normally see in another format. But the whole big screen on the right there is a sandbox where you try it out, in this case Python. So you type your Python code, it's evaluated in real time, and you can see what you're doing right or what you're doing wrong. Depending on the producer of the content, there might be some particular exercises that are set up. They might give you some code with blanks in it and you fill it in, or it might be a true sandbox where they just ask you to solve something and you do it in the sandbox window. if anybody was here on Thursday, one of the Kubernetes workshops used a Katacoda container to demonstrate Kubernetes. So you can do this with systems content as well. Okay. The key point of the interactive, though, is that the practice, as I said, is central. You don't skip over it. So these are some folks that make the interactive content. Some of them also make video content, so you might have to go looking through their site to find what you're looking for. I have to change this slide every time I give this talk because these companies spring up and they go away and they get bought. So this is still a very volatile area. And the other big thing I want to point out about interactives is they're pretty new. So depending on the topic you're looking for, you may or may not find an interactive to learn from. If you want to learn Python, if you want to learn JavaScript, that'll be pretty easy. If you're a big fan of Elixir or Lua and you want to learn that stuff, not yet. Hopefully soon. Then the last type that I want to talk about is formal training. And this can be anything from the workshops that were done earlier this week to taking an actual university class to hiring a consultant to come to your company and give some specialized instruction to your team. And it's basically what you're doing right now. It engages the audio style. It engages the reading-writing style depending on the length. In an hour talk like this, I'm not going to have supplementary material. But if you're at a university class length, yeah, there's going to be a textbook. If you're taking a 3-day workshop, they've probably got some papers for you to read and some practice to do. So the kinesthetic should be there depending on the instructor. But it does tend to be built into the format. The idea that every so often you're going to stop, you're going to practice, and then maybe we'll talk about it. Or assistant instructors will help you with it if you're having difficulty. Now, I don't have a big list for where you get instructors from. There's some, but that's because a lot of this is geographically limited. So if you want to take a university course, find a university that's near you. If you want to find a consultant, that's probably something that's going to be geographically limited to near you. You can bring in a consultant from farther away, that's going to be expensive. One thing that tends to come up at this point, though, people ask about distance learning. So you have the instructor in Australia and you're in New York watching through the magic of the internet, which is fantastic and helps with that geo-limiting problem if it goes both ways. If you have the opportunity from New York to ask some questions or to get some feedback on your practice, then yeah, distance learning is working the way it would if you were face-to-face. Oftentimes, though, you'll find that the person in Australia is just giving a lecture and you have no way of asking questions or giving feedback. At that point, it's just a video that you happen to be watching in real time. Nothing wrong with that, just don't mistake it for instruction. Okay, I've gone through the formats. I've explained how the formats map to the various styles. Some other things to consider when it comes down to actually choosing, and this gets a little bit practical. The first one is the pacing. And by pacing, I don't just mean how fast does the material go. I mean how much do you as the consumer have control over the pace? In other words, can I go forward? Can I go forward faster and skip over things? I've heard that some people like to watch videos at 1.5 times. Hello to anyone doing that? How easy is it to go back? If you've got a book, it's fairly simple to say, okay, I remember that thing I read yesterday, let me go look for it. So I've made a very advanced chart mapping this out. With books and with video, you have a lot of control. Books have a very comfortable user experience. It's been around for 500 years. We know how to skip forward and back in a book. Video is getting there. It's easy to go forward. Going back should be fairly easy, but actually pinpointing the spot with the information you want, a little bit harder with a video. Interactives I've put in the middle here because a lot of them, the pacing depends on you doing the exercises. You won't be able to advance to the next exercise until you finish the current one, and some of them won't necessarily let you go back. So the pacing is less under your control. In the case of training, the pacing is entirely up to the instructor. Now, a good instructor can read the room and speed up, slow down, repeat things if they want to. but it's still not under the consumer's control. It's entirely out of your hands. Practice. You may get the impression that I think practice is important. I've been mentioning this. How much opportunity do you have to practice? But furthermore, how much choice do you have over whether or not you do it? So I've already said, interactives make the practice central to the learning experience. You don't get to move forward until you've actually done it. Training and classroom instruction, again, generally will have time for practice. It could be formal homework, or it could be, hey, let's stop and try this out. But that does tend to be baked in. So video and books, like I've already mentioned, the opportunity to practice is there, but you have to take that on yourself. It's pretty easy when you're reading a book to just get to the end of the chapter and be excited about going to the next one, so you skip the practice problems. Or you're reading along with the examples that I mentioned that are contained in the chapter, and you're just kind of nodding along, yeah, I get it, I get it, I get it. If you want the practice to be effective, you have to take it on yourself to do it. Okay. Feedback is the thing that goes along with practice. You can practice all day long, but if you're practicing wrong, you're learning the wrong thing. You may know you're doing it wrong, or you may be getting an answer and not know whether it's right or wrong at all. So when it comes to feedback, in-person training excels. Not every instructor is going to have the opportunity for feedback, but it should be pretty simple with an instructor to say, I was doing this practice, now I'm lost, I don't quite get what I'm supposed to be doing. Hopefully an instructor will stop and help you, or an assistant instructor, something like that. The interactives are pretty good at giving feedback if the way you screwed up was the way the designer thought you were going to. In other words, if you typed in equals when you should have typed a double equals, they can account for that and say, give you a little pop-up, say this is where you went wrong. If you are one of the very gifted, like myself, who's good at screwing code up in ways that no one's ever seen before, the interactive is going to be lost, whereas a trainer would be able to go to look at it and say, oh, okay, I see what you did there. And video and books are all the way at the other end of the scale because they're pretty much a one-way street when it comes to feedback. Now, if you buy a book or a video, you may find that the publisher has a forum where people who use the book can discuss problems or hopefully talk to the author. You may be able to contact the author via email, but there tends to be a scaling problem there. If your author has sold 10,000 books, they might not be able to support 10,000 people having a problem. And the further away from the publication date you get in time, the less likely the author is to still be around and willing to support it. But the options are there. It's just, again, harder, and you have to take it on yourself. Then there's cost. Let's get really practical. Like I said, I've been in publishing 25 years. I have heard all the complaints about technical books cost too much. Let's go to the chart, though. Training is going to be the most expensive. If you're hiring someone to come to your place of business and give a training, that costs, especially if you're bringing them in from somewhere else. University costs, a little bit less. The interactives in the video are in the middle of the chart because a lot of their producers have adopted a subscription model. You pay a certain amount of money per month, you get access to all of their content. It's very similar to the subscription that you have to your gym, and you probably know what I'm going to say next. So people tend to use them about as much as you would use the gym. So again, you have to take it on yourself. Relative to the rest of this, the single price for a book that you get to keep forever, not all that bad. They are still expensive, I get that. There are ways that you can mitigate that. Ebooks cost a little bit less. Used bookstores, you can sometimes find tech books, libraries. Okay, I'm not going to endorse piracy because I work for the publishers, but there are methods in which to bring down the list price of a book. And then the last factor I want to talk about is availability. And I don't just mean by that, is there a bookstore nearby where I can go out and get one, although that's part of it. What I mean is the barrier to entry. Do I need any special equipment to use this? How easy is it for me to set this up? Well, when it comes to availability, books are fantastic. You got a book, that's everything you need. Like I said, it's a 500-year-old UX, and it's the only one of these that you can do on a beach, should that be your choice. With a video, you're probably going to need something to play it back on. You're probably going to need to be online at least initially to get it. A little bit more of a barrier to entry. Interactives, you're probably going to have to be online while you're actually doing it. So barriers a little bit higher. And training has the highest barriers to availability because, as previously mentioned, people don't scale. So that's just a matter of how many instructors are there and can I get one. Okay. I've thrown lots of formats at you. I've thrown lots of things to consider at you. Is this the point where I go, okay, it's up to you, decide for yourself? No, actually, I'm going to make concrete recommendations. So if your resources are a factor, by which I mean money or the barriers to entry or your time, so you want to keep those costs low, get a book or a video depending on your preferred learning style. The trade-off for this that you'll have to bear in mind is that you're going to have to motivate yourself to do the practice, and you may not be able to get the feedback that you're looking for. But if cost is your overriding concern, yeah, books and video are the way to go about it. If you've got resources and fewer barriers to entry, and you're by yourself, I recommend an interactive. Interactive front loads the practice, forces you to do it, and like I said, practice is the important part. So yeah, interactives are the way to go if there is one available in the topic that you want. If it's not, that's a barrier to entry. And then finally, if you've got resources and you've got a group, in other words, if your company is paying for it, then go for a training. You've got that practice front-loaded, the feedback is built in and part of it. So that's going to maximize your kinesthetic part of the experience. All right. Having made solid recommendations, I will now proceed to walk them back. None of this is foolproof. You could hire an instructor who came highly recommended and you think this is going to be great, and they get here and they're jet lagged and they're sick and they just don't give you their best performance. Okay. Stuff happens. You might buy a book that you thought was right for you. It seemed like it was a good idea, but it's not clicking. So what steps can you take to prevent that problem from happening? First of all, check out the reviews. There's a rather lovely website you might have heard of. It's called Amazon, that holds reviews for every book ever published anywhere on the planet. And they've got star ratings there. But I would encourage you, don't just go by the star ratings. Actually read the reviews. Make sure that the reviewers are something like you. In other words, if you're looking for a good beginner book, and you come across a 2-star review, and the reviewer says, you know, it didn't have these 5 advanced topics that I was looking for. Okay, that customer probably bought the wrong book. He bought something that was too basic. So look for the reviewers who are in situations similar to you rather than just reducing it to a number. If you can, get personalized recommendations. People you work with, friends who know this material. What did you learn from? Do you think it would work for me? What do you think would best fit with, you know, what you know about me? Next thing you can do is trust the gatekeepers. I know gatekeeper is a dirty word, especially in the open source community. In the publishing community, it means something a little bit different. The publishers act as gatekeepers. They vet the content. They decide what to publish, and hopefully they only publish stuff of quality. Find ones that you trust. If you found a video company that you liked their video and you were able to learn from it, then maybe another video from them would be similarly successful. Same thing with authors. If you read a book by a particular author, then another book by that author might give you a similar level of success. Free samples. Who doesn't like a free sample, right? Most of these content creators will provide that. Go to Amazon, you can read a few pages up to a chapter of a given book. The folks with the subscription models, they will often have a 7-day or 14-day free trial. I'm not saying that you need the sample to give you a complete learning experience. What you want to do is get just enough of it in order to say, is this enjoyable for me? Can I see myself spending another 10, 20, 30 hours with this type of content, and would I get something out of that? Okay. So you've removed all the blockers, you've analyzed your style, you've chosen a format, you've analyzed everything, and you're working with the content and it still doesn't seem to be clicking for you. What do you do at this point? Because sometimes things go wrong. Look for those blockers that we talked about back at the beginning of the talk. You know, was I hungry? Was I studying at the wrong time of day? Did I let those blockers creep back in and prevent me from having a good learning experience? Did my motivation change? Sometimes you're learning a new language and you're excited about it at the beginning, and as you go through it, you start seeing some design decisions that you don't really agree with, and your motivation to learn that fades over time. So ask yourself some questions, be honest with yourself. But if you've gone through all of that and you've decided, you know what, it's not me, it's you, okay, this content is not working for you for whatever reason. And at that point, you want to avoid the sunk cost fallacy. Here's my big takeaway. If it's not working for you, go find something that does. See how I brought that back from the beginning of the talk? There is no Xbox achievement for finishing a book that you hated just so that you could get through to the end of it out of sheer bloody-mindedness. If it's not working, go find something else. Is that going to cost you some money? Yeah, it is. Balance that against the potential gains of a successful learning experience. And I think you'll find that the $50 or whatever that the book cost you is less significant. So don't be afraid to cut your losses. Just make sure that you know that it's the content and not something internal. All right. So some tips that go towards the end here. Mix and match your formats. Just because you bought a book doesn't mean you're locked into using only that book for the entire experience. If you are watching a video and you're like, hey, this video is really great, but some of these commands, they're a little bit hard to remember, I could use a reference. There's a book or an online reference that you could use to remember those commands. Or you're reading a book and you're saying, this is a good book, but well, I really wish it had more practice problems. Maybe you can find an interactive on that same topic. Yeah, that's going to cost you a little more money again, but the trade-off is a better, more enhanced learning experience. And I want to take a moment to talk about the special case of working in groups. In other words, doing this at work. I've heard of teams at work that have been doing what they call tech book clubs, where they all read a book together and they discuss it and they work on the problems, and I think that's fantastic. There's some positives and negatives that go along with working in groups. The positives are we all work together on it and we can reinforce each other. So if we all read chapter 3 last night and you got it and I didn't, and I'm saying help me out here, you can teach me what you learned, engage that audio style, so then I can catch up and it enhances your learning experience. And that's all to the better, lifts the group. Maybe together you find some projects to work on. And you also have that idea of the rest of the group is counting on me, I can't just put this down and say I'll come back to it later and then never do. There's a flip side to this though. If some of the members of your group are not motivated, if they're just saying from the beginning, I'm not interested in this subject, I'm not going to get interested in this subject, I'm only doing this because I have to, that's going to sabotage the entire learning experience for the rest of the group. Now, how to solve that, that's a management issue and that's a talk for another day. But I will suggest that if you think that problem is happening, find out fast. You do not want to let one or two unmotivated people go through the whole process and sabotage the learning experience. So, last word about what learning in groups, it's high risk, high reward. All right, that brings us to the end slide. A couple of resources I want to mention. The Pragmatic Programmer, which is where the quote came from at the beginning of the talk by Andy and Dave, has a lot of this practical stuff, more stuff about what I talked about. If you are more interested in the learning philosophy, the educational theory, I recommend Pragmatic Thinking and Learning from the same publisher. Full disclosure, this was my former employer. But you'll find that sort of information in there. So we've got some time, it looks like. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
You talk about learning in groups could be poison. Are there other poisons in this process? Perhaps poison learning mechanisms or poison content?
Is there bad content or bad learning mechanisms? I'm going to say that if you're dealing with officially vetted content that has gone through more than one pair of eyes, a subject matter expert or an editor, hopefully more than one, you probably won't have bad content, or at least the odds of your finding legitimately bad content are fairly low. What is much more likely is finding content that is not right for you. And that's something that you're going to have to discover through trial and error. You might think that you've found, you might find that, yes, I have a reading, writing, learning style, and you're reading a bunch of different books and it's not clicking with you. Turns out that maybe you didn't have a reading style after all. It's just what you've been forced to do all through school. And so that came automatically. The thing throughout this process is to always be open to the idea that there's something mentally or motivationally that you haven't examined closely enough and need to change. But yeah, content that doesn't work for you is actually fairly common, and you're probably going to run into some of it at some point, and that's why I emphasize don't fall into that sunk cost fallacy. Thanks for the question. Yes?
I like your mention part of the one thing, one dimension that you didn't mention was like staleness of the resource.
Yes, staleness of the resource. No, you're entirely right. And thank you for bringing that up. Fortunately, with a lot of the newer content, things don't get stale quite as quickly. This is a place where reviews can help you, but also, at least books have copyright dates on them. They often will have a version number. If you're dealing with, version 3 of the language, it might say so on the cover. But yeah, that's a case where you're going to want to read reviews and you're going to want to make sure that's up to date. That is a trap that people have fallen into, especially with system stuff, which isn't versioned quite as prominently. We know what version of Kubernetes we're using, but that might not necessarily appear on the book cover because it'll be different by next week. So yeah, especially with system stuff, you want to be careful and look up the date that it was published. If you're looking for, stuff about Kubernetes from 2016, odds are a lot of that's going to have changed. Yes?
I just wanted to mention one of the things you covered completely was the fact that libraries might have these resources available if your resources scrap.
Yes.
I've worked in libraries for a lot of years. We have a lot of resources that people are usually unfamiliar with. There's usually online content, there's interactive tutorials, lynda.com things. But if you find that there's a book that you want to use and they don't have it, send them an email. Chances are they'll get it for you. Or an interlibrary loan can get it for you in a matter of days. So yeah, definitely check with your library for scrap.
I'll repeat that for the recording. So I have left out all the good that libraries can do for us. They have a lot of different formats, and that if you, make sure I got this right, if you don't see the format that you want or you don't see the product that you want, you can request it via interlibrary loan. I got that?
Yeah,
All right.
you can ask physicians, they'll even buy it too. That's awesome.
Excellent. Well, let me ask you something then. One of my concerns about library would be the staleness, that a lot of that content would be not necessarily cleaned out all that often. Is that fair?
Definitely with physical collections, yes. But more and more libraries are moving to digital collections. So, for instance, there's a good resource called Springer Books
Right.
that you can get a subscription to, and they have massive numbers of titles that are updated regularly, and you can get all of them for free, DRM-free, like through your library. Just download the whole PDF and read it.
Excellent. Okay. So yes, if you haven't checked out your local library lately, see what they've got. They may be in the 21st century.
They've gotten better too. At least ours has far better up-to-date stuff that they did even 5 years ago.
Cool. Our tax dollars at work.
Much better.
It's worth emphasizing many libraries have subscriptions to LinkedIn Learning and things like that.
Right.
That can be used through your library membership if you can't afford your own subscription.
Excellent. Yes. So a lot of the stuff, the subscription-based stuff that I mentioned earlier, libraries will often have a subscription that you can use to that content. That's great. That's fantastic.
Or use it to buy a book they don't have.
Actually, go to the librarian and they'll tell you what they have.
All right, we like libraries. Yay for open source. I should have known an open source conference. We like libraries. Anything else? Yes. What is the proper ratio of intake to practice? That is an excellent question. I would say there's a reason why you often find the practice exercises at the end of a chapter. So in other words, it's not necessarily how much physical time have I spent, but have I gotten enough content to constitute a single unit of learning? So in other words, if I'm halfway through a chapter, then I probably haven't gotten all the information I need to make the practice effective. Hopefully these instructional materials are designed in such a way that they make it clear this is where you should take a break. We've broken up the chapter, we've broken up the videos. In an a training situation, they might break up the instruction and say now is the time to practice. So I would say trust the materials for that, but again, when the pacing is under your control, then the practice is going to be under your control too. And there is nothing wrong. I know I mentioned, that urge to, I finished chapter 3, I want to start chapter 4 right now, I'm going to skip over. If that's still within your control, that you want to do the practice at a different time, maybe when you're more alert or something like that, that's fine. You have the ability to basically control your own pace, but just make sure that you do it and you don't skip it. So, concrete answer to your question is going to be trial and error. If you find that you're doing the practice problems and you're not retaining the content from the chapter, then yeah, maybe you want to break it up a little bit more. If you find like you're practicing all the time, well, I might say that's not a terrible thing, but you still have to have that information intake. So find the balance for you, and keep in mind it's going to change from day to day. So, yes?
What's a good way to discover my learning style, or if possible, to transition to a new learning style?
Oh. How do you discover your learning style or transition to a different one? I hate to keep coming back to this, but trial and error. You'll know if you're comfortable with a particular style. Fortunately, for most of us living in the United States, we've had several years of exposure to various learning methods. So you can think back to what happened in school. Did I learn more from a lecture or did I learn more from a textbook? Bearing in mind that some textbooks are better than others and some lecturers are better than others. But as to how can you change your style, that is a good question I haven't considered. I would say experimentation. Because we don't know a lot about these styles and how they work physiologically, they're probably not hardwired. I would guess that if you were bound and determined to find a reading style, that you could develop it over time just through practice and exposure. Whether or not it's worth that amount of time, that's up to you. Thank you. All right. I think we're pretty good here. This is the last session of the conference, so if anybody has a question they wanted to ask personally or something, I'm going to hang out here for a little while. Feel free to come up. But other than that, I'm Brian MacDonald from DigitalOcean. That's my contact info. I wish you the best of luck with your learning processes. Drop me a note. Let me know how it went, if you succeeded. And otherwise, I thank you for the gift of your time.